The Vietnam War. A war fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but felt in the homes of millions across the world. A war of fire and fear. A war that changed America, changed Vietnam, and changed history itself. In this documentary, we will walk through the full journey, from the origins that began long before America arrived, to the final moments when Saigon fell. This is a story of hope, pain, courage, and loss. This is the Vietnam War. Fade into jungle fog. Long before American soldiers stepped into the forests of Vietnam, the Vietnamese people had spent centuries fighting for control of their own land. First against old Asian empires. Then against European powers. In the 1800s, France took over Vietnam. They brought new laws, new rulers, and new systems. But many Vietnamese people dreamed of freedom. They wanted to lead themselves. They wanted their own nation. After World War II, this dream grew stronger. A man named Ho Chi Minh, a leader who had lived overseas and studied politics, returned home with a mission: to free Vietnam from foreign rule. He formed the Viet Minh, a group of fighters determined to drive the French out. And in 1954, after a long and painful war, the Viet Minh won the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French surrendered. Their empire in Southeast Asia ended. But Vietnam's victory did not bring peace. It opened the door to a new conflict, a conflict the world was not prepared for. Vietnam was split. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, communist. South Vietnam, supported by the United States, anti-communist. The stage was set. The world was entering the Cold War. And Vietnam would soon become its bloodiest battlefield. In the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War was shaping global politics. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense struggle for influence around the world. America feared communism. They believed if one country fell to communist control, others would follow. This belief was called the domino theory. Vietnam, to American leaders, was one of those dominoes. So the U.S. began helping the South Vietnamese government. At first, they sent money. Then advisors. Then weapons. Most American leaders did not think a full war was coming. Many believed they were simply preventing a small problem from becoming bigger. But slowly, Vietnam was pulling America deeper and deeper in. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong, communist fighters in the South, launched frequent attacks on government forces. Villages turned fearful. Roads became dangerous. The U.S. sent more advisors. More support. More equipment. And then, in 1964, everything changed. Late at night, in August 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, reported that it had been attacked by North Vietnamese boats. The United States reacted fast. President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress for permission to use military force. Congress agreed. This moment, called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, opened the gates for full-scale American involvement. And just months later, U.S. Marines stepped onto Vietnamese soil in large numbers. Helicopters filled the sky. Armored vehicles rolled onto the beaches. Young men, many barely out of high school, were suddenly in the middle of a war they did not fully understand. What started as a small conflict had now become one of America's largest military operations in history. Vietnam was unlike anything American soldiers had ever seen. The country was covered in dense jungle, thick mud, and mountains hidden beneath clouds. The heat was crushing. The rain could fall for days. Mosquitoes carried sickness. The land itself became an enemy. But the true challenge was the Viet Cong. They did not fight like traditional armies. They hid in villages, moved silently through forests, and struck without warning. They were everywhere, and nowhere. American soldiers often said, "You don't see the Viet Cong, you feel them." They used ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, booby traps hidden under leaves, tunnels stretching for miles underground. The U.S. had power, helicopters, bombs, artillery, tanks. But the Viet Cong had patience and knowledge of the land. Every river could hide danger. Every bush could conceal an attacker. Every step could trigger an explosion. Many soldiers described Vietnam as a beautiful land turned into a maze of fear. In 1965, the United States launched a massive bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder. For more than 3 years, American planes dropped millions of tons of bombs on North Vietnam. Roads, bridges, factories, and supply routes were targeted. But the North Vietnamese did not break. Every time a road was destroyed, they repaired it. Every time a bridge fell, they built another. They hid their supplies underground, camouflaged their camps, and moved through the jungle like shadows. The war kept growing. North Vietnam supplied the Viet Cong using a long network of pathways known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail ran through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, protected by mountains and thick forests. Even heavy bombing could not stop it. Supplies kept moving. Troops kept marching. America discovered a painful truth. High-tech weapons could not easily defeat an enemy that did not fight in the open. The longer the war went on, the more it became a test of human endurance. Many U.S. soldiers arrived with strong spirits, but the jungle wore them down. Days blurred into nights. Fear became normal. Survival became everything. Letters home became soldiers' lifelines, messages to girlfriends, parents, wives, children. Many carried small photos in their helmets, reminders of the world they left behind. But back home, Americans were beginning to see something they had never seen in any war before. Real footage on television. Every night, people watched images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, crying civilians, and battlefield chaos. The war was no longer distant. It was in America's living rooms. And people began to ask, why are our boys dying so far from home? During Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, both sides were expected to pause the fighting. But instead, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a huge surprise attack across more than 100 towns and cities. This moment became known as the Tet Offensive. Gunfire exploded in the streets. Cities once thought safe were suddenly battlegrounds. American and South Vietnamese forces were shocked, but they pushed back hard. Military experts say the U.S. won many of the battles. But politically, the damage was done. Americans watching from home were stunned. They had been told the war was almost over. But Tet proved it was far from ending. Confidence in the government collapsed. Protests spread across the U.S. Families grew divided. The war outside had become a war inside America. After Tet, leaders in Washington knew the war could not continue forever. The new president, Richard Nixon, created a plan called Vietnamization. Its goal was simple. Train South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting so American troops could come home. The withdrawal began slowly. Thousands of U.S. soldiers returned home each year. But the war did not stop. Fighting continued in cities, jungles, and mountain ranges. The U.S. expanded bombing into Cambodia and Laos, hoping to cut enemy supply lines. The conflict grew wider. More lives were lost. More people questioned the purpose. By the early 1970s, peace talks were underway. A fragile agreement was reached in 1973. American combat troops finally left Vietnam. But deep inside, many soldiers carried the war with them long after they stepped off the plane. Trauma. Nightmares. Memories they wished they could forget. The United States' role in the war was over. But the war itself was not finished. Without American troops on the ground, South Vietnam stood alone. They fought bravely. They defended cities, villages, and roads. But North Vietnam launched a powerful series of attacks in 1975. Town after town fell. Resistance collapsed. And then the world saw the final moment. The fall of Saigon. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city. Helicopters lifted people from rooftops in desperate evacuations. Crowds ran to escape. Chaos filled the streets. On April 30, 1975, the flag of North Vietnam was raised over Saigon. The war was over. Vietnam was united, but at a tremendous cost. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 58,000 Americans killed. More than 3 million Vietnamese died. Thousands missing in action. Entire towns destroyed. Millions of families broken. But the emotional cost was even deeper. Many American veterans returned home to a country that did not welcome them as heroes. Some faced silence. Others faced anger. Many struggled with trauma, depression, and physical wounds. In Vietnam, the scars were even greater. Fields were burned. Villages destroyed. Millions lived with fear long after the fighting stopped. The land carried scars from bombs and chemicals. The people carried scars in their hearts. War does not end when the guns go silent. Its echoes last for generations. In the decades after the war, both Vietnam and the United States began healing. Vietnam slowly rebuilt. New buildings rose from ruins. Rice fields returned. Children grew up in peace instead of war. The United States began honoring its veterans, building memorials, and supporting those affected by the conflict. Former enemies became partners. Today, America and Vietnam share economic ties, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic relationships that once seemed impossible. The world learned hard lessons from the Vietnam War. The limits of power. The importance of understanding another culture. The human cost of political decisions. The danger of misjudging local conflicts. Today, the Vietnam War remains one of the most studied conflicts in history. Books, films, music, and documentaries try to capture its meaning. But no single story can explain everything. To some, it was a tragedy. To others, a lesson. To others still, a reminder of bravery and sacrifice. But one truth remains. The war was fought by people, humans with dreams, fears, and families. People who wanted to live. People who were caught in events larger than themselves. And their stories continue to shape how we understand war, peace, and the price of both. The Vietnam War was not just a chapter in history. It was a storm that crossed oceans and generations. A storm that tested nations and individuals. And although the fighting ended decades ago, its lessons continue to guide the world today. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you want more cinematic stories from history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, remember the past, honor the fallen, and keep searching for truth.